from the Dawul people. Dawul people go all the way down to Thurul. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting, the people of the Dawul language group, the Gadigal, Birrabirragal and Bidjara people. We pay our respects to the spirits that guide us, those elders whose words and actions shape our decisions and point us on our path, whose knowledge has been given to us freely so we may look after country and family. We pay our respects to elders present, and there are many, many incredible elders, and elders from other communities here today. We request that emerging elders of the land keep up the traditions by learning, understanding, and telling the story of the land that we live, learn, and walk on, for we are all part of the story of this land. This story, this path we're on now, is a simple maths equation. 65,000 plus 250. I'm pretty sure that's 65,250. It's not 250 minus 65,000. We all gain here. There are no losers. There is no loss. Nothing is being given away. 65,000 years of knowledge, tradition, sustainability, and science, plus 250 years of modernisation, technology, wonderful institutions of learning and government, and brilliant people coming to live here from all over the world. We all win. 65,250 years is a greater history than 250 years. We just have to add them together. Let's walk side by side with a shared history, a proud history. Be proud of us and the amazing sustainability of this culture. It's yours as well. It's your history. It's your culture. It's our history. It's our culture. We are adding to it, not taking away. My friend and elder Wallingarry says, in the old times before the boats came, we were 250 nations. We have always been multicultural. In modern times, we added 200 more. And every time we add a culture, we gain food, music, learnings, a new way to look at things. My culture says the earth is our mother. We get everything we need from her. That makes you and I brother and sister. There is one constant. This one thing is certain. This one thing is our truth. We are all part of the story of this land. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean, for that very moving acknowledgement of country. I think it was absolutely beautiful, and I think is a wonderful way to start today, because we are all part of the story of this land. And I think today's conversation is about the future of that story and the story that we are writing together. I'd also like to acknowledge the land on which we're meeting, the land of the Gadigal, Bidjara and Birrabirragal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, as well as acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here with us today. And we're here on very special and important business. We're here to discuss the proposal that will be put to us at the end of this year. We've brought everyone together to have a constructive and respectful conversation about this topic. There are many in our community who are very supportive of the voice. And there are many also in our community who are not sure, who have questions, perhaps aren't supportive. The purpose of tonight is to give people across our community the tools and information to make informed decisions, because this is a really important decision that we're facing. Let me be clear, I am a very strong supporter of the voice and the referendum. I support the voice because I believe that the recognition of our First Nations people in our Constitution will address the historical failure that was made at the time of Federation, when no First Nations people were present. But most importantly, because I believe that the voice will make a practical difference and it will strengthen our democracy. I believe that good policies come when people affected by them are consulted and included in the decision. And that's the basis of my philosophy, whatever the policy area. Governments have been making laws about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for many years, but they haven't been making that policy with them, and the impact of the policies speak for themselves. I believe this is a chance to change that. Past consultative bodies have come and gone with the whim of government, and this is an opportunity to build sustainability, stability and trust. It is a chance to have recognition, make a practical difference, and still invest and support our strong democratic institutions. That's my belief. But I understand it's not the view of everyone here tonight. And what I've learnt in life is that it's not good enough to have a passionate view about a question and expect everyone else to join in with you and agree with you. Your first job is to listen, to understand what are the questions that people have, and to have a respectful conversation about that. And that's what tonight is all about. So let's start where we all agree. I believe everyone in this country and everyone in this room wants Australia and all its people to thrive, including Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Let's start the conversation from that point of view and then consider how does the voice support that objective of all Australians thriving for our country. And let's be really clear on what's being asked of us. Later this year, we're going to be asked if we agree to a proposed change in the Constitution. And that change will be, and I'll read it out, in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia, there shall be a body called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. Point 2. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice may make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And 3, the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have powers to make law with respect to matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures. So that is the question that we're going to be facing this year. And here are the people I'm going to introduce, are going to give us some of the answers to some of the questions that many of you have raised about this proposal. So firstly, let me introduce Professor Tom Calma AO. He is an Aboriginal elder from Kunga Arakan tribal group, and he's member of the Iwaja, I feel like I'm doing a terrible job of this, Tom, tribal group in the Northern Territory. Tom is one of Australia's most respected social justice campaigners, leading the way on the Close the Gap campaign, Reconciliation Australia and the Voice to Parliament. He's the Chancellor of the University of Canberra, member of the Referendum Working Group, and earlier this year was recognised as Senior Australian of the Year. Lovely to have you tonight. We also have Ruby Langton-Batty, a proud descendant of the Bidjara people and Iman people of the Central Queensland. Holding a Juris Doctor from the University of New South Wales, Ruby is a solicitor in Ashurst's pro bono team. Welcome, Ruby. And finally here with me, I've got Dr. Shireen Morris, who's a constitutional lawyer and director of the Radical Centre Reform Lab at Macquarie University Law School. She has advised Cape York Institute on constitutional reform for 12 years and has worked with Noel Pearson to help devise and advocate the concept of a constitutional voice since 2014. I think we can all acknowledge that we have some absolutely wonderful expertise and perspectives in the room, so it's delightful to have you all here. So lastly, let me get you through how tonight's event's going to work. We're going to have some prepared questions that cover the basic of the voice and the major questions that have arisen out of some of the conversations we've had so far with the community. Following this, we're going to move on to some questions that have been submitted by our Google Forms by different people who are here tonight. And then finally, we'll move to some questions on the floor, depending a bit on time. To do this, we ask you to scan the QR code on the screen. So if you would like to submit a question, can you scan that QR code on the screen? Keep the page open and fill out your questions through the event, keeping in mind that your questions might already be answered by the time we get to them. And if you lose the page at any point, we've got our helpers around the room, so they can also, they've got on a piece of paper, so you can scan it also on your phone through that. But before we move on to the questions, I'd like to invite Ruby to read the Uluru Statement from the Heart and share what it means for her.
Hello? Yeah. We gathered at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did, according to the reckoning of our culture from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom, remain attached thereto and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished, and it coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise? That peoples possessed of a land for 60 millennia, and this sacred link disappears from the world in merely the last 200 years? With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionally, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We're not an innately criminal people. Our children are alienated from their families at unprecedented levels. This cannot be because we have no love for them. Our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the enshrinement of a First Nations voice, we call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk up with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future.
Thank you so much, Ruby, for reading that. I'd love to just start with a question of what does that mean to you?
Hello?
Yeah.
Sorry. It's always such a huge honour when I get the opportunity to read that aloud in front of people. Each time I get to 2017, I get a bit of a surprise. Oh, it's been going on for so long, but the process that led up to the Uluru Statement from the Heart and all of the dialogues that happened was one of the most profound and important moments in our history, and to have the opportunity to read that out in front of everyone always just fills me with so much pride and hope and optimism. And I really think that Australia will take up the invitation in the spirit that it was given. Yeah. And I'd also add, it always makes me reflect on my own family history, which is, as you heard earlier, on my mother's side, I'm a descendant of the Iman and Bidjara people of Central Queensland, who lived there since time immemorial, since the creation. We still have our languages and our culture. Our native title has been recognised. But my elders lived through brutal treatment under the Queensland apartheid regime. But they worked hard and fought to make sure that I had the opportunities that they never got to have. So I always make sure I make the most of that. And then on the other side of my family, on my dad's side, my first ancestors in Australia came on the First Fleet in 1788. So it's quite an interesting place to be in terms of your identity. And I'm proud of both of those histories. And I think, this year, this referendum represents an opportunity for us to have an honest relationship with our history.
I'm going to get to, well actually Tom, I'd love to get your perspective as well. What does the Uluru Statement mean to you?
Yeah, well, like Ruby, it was, it's something that still has a fairly profound effect in hearing it read out, knowing the sort of background and the challenges that got us there, and then the generosity of everybody who was there, including many elders from right across Australia, to be able to want to create an environment where we as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have a greater acceptance within Australian society, to be able to address, the doctrine of terra nullius, which was, overturned with Mabo and the High Court decision, which addresses that issue that when the First Fleet first arrived, the notion that there was nobody here, so there was never ever a need to establish a treaty. And we'll go on and touch on this a bit more in a minute, but it does fill me and my family with a lot of pride, knowing that finally, and Uluru Statement's just a vehicle to address. There's still a lot of work to go, and address through the referendum, through legislation, through changes of attitudes of people. So, we don't see this as the be-all, end-all. This is just another one of those, facilitating documents to a better future.
Thank you. So I'm going to come to the question, which is, why do we need a referendum? Why does the voice to Parliament actually need to be in the Constitution? And Shireen, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Allegra. So let me offer a bit of a constitutional perspective to what you've both just said, and I totally agree that the Uluru Statement is such a generous, warm offering, sort of like a peace offering from Indigenous people to all Australians. And when you look at the constitutional history of Australia, when the former colonies spent a decade in the 1800s negotiating how they were going to unite to form one country, Australia, in 1901, and they negotiated and negotiated, but there was not a single Indigenous representative in those discussions. And as a result, the constitution that came into force in 1901 contained clauses explicitly excluding Indigenous people. You talked about terra nullius. Professor Patrick Dodson once said, the Constitution was drafted in the spirit of terra nullius, kind of drafted as if Indigenous people didn't exist. And as a result, it created this really top-down power relationship between Australian governments and Indigenous peoples. And as Ruby mentioned, as a result, Indigenous people have endured many decades of very harsh and discriminatory laws and policies under the Constitution, especially in the past, like laws in some jurisdictions saying Indigenous people couldn't vote right up until the 60s, laws and policies banning their languages from being spoken, controlling where they could live, who they could marry, controlling whether they could buy a car, in some cases, of course, denying their land rights and that kind of thing. And so because of that, Indigenous people for decades have asked to be recognised in the Constitution from which they've been excluded. And they've asked for substantive recognition to create a fairer power relationship rather than a top-down power relationship. But what was so extraordinary about the Uluru Statement is that was the first time that Indigenous people formed a united national consensus on how they wanted to be constitutionally recognised. And they asked for a constitutionally guaranteed Indigenous advisory body, a voice, so that when Parliament and government make laws and policies about Indigenous affairs, Indigenous communities can at least give advice and partner in the development of those laws and policies. And in answer to your question, why does it need to be in the Constitution? Well, one, because Indigenous people saying they want to be recognised in the Constitution from which they've been omitted for so long, but secondly, so that their voice is guaranteed. You know, because so many of the Indigenous advisory bodies of the past, that if they're enacted just in legislation, they can be abolished very easily. So the Constitution is where enduring guarantees are made. It's a place where we make structural promises, but it's a place where we establish enduring institutions and set up the principles that govern the way we run this country in a long-term, intergenerational sense. So that's why they're asking for recognition in the Constitution and for their voice to be guaranteed in the Constitution.
I think the other bit when we talk about, and we're here to talk about recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, within the Constitution, the actual race powers weren't designed for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. They were designed for people of colour, mainly for Asians and other minority peoples here. It's just that they've been applied only to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That's section 5126.
A question then for you, Tom, is about, will this make a tangible difference? Because I think there are a lot of people, I think across the country who say, we want to make a tangible difference. Is this going to be the thing that actually really makes a big difference to people's lives?
It has the real potential too. But what we have to remember is that we are going through a process. The referendum is a facilitation process to enable the Parliament to develop the structure, the laws, the powers of the voice. And it depends what happens at the end of the day as to what it will be structured like. What we do know is that both the previous government and the current government have said that the co-design report that was developed by 51 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and that Ruby's mother actually and myself co-authored that one, that's the co-design report, will form the foundation of what the question that'll be put post a referendum. And that, but the process, and this is why people say there's no detail, it's all vague and all that sort of stuff, and it is. Legislations like the ATSIC legislation, the bill that went through, that was tabled before the formation of ATSIC, it went through 130 amendments before the legislation came out. So with all legislation, what goes in as a bill is not necessarily what's going to come out as legislation at the end of the day. So it's very difficult to be very precise about it. But if they follow what we've proposed, there's two levels. There's a national voice, and that is the one that's going to be in the Constitution that will be working with the Australian Parliament, that'll look at Commonwealth laws and legislation, Commonwealth programs, and work with Commonwealth departments and entities. And it won't have any powers, in fact, over the states and territories unless the government or the Parliament of the day utilises those elements of the Constitution that give them powers over the territories. And that's all, not the states. So what'll happen at the end of the day, we expect that each of the jurisdictions, the states and territories, will establish their own voice, and the government, the previous government and the current government, have both put aside money for that to happen, and they'll establish upwards to 35 regional voices who will primarily report to the state, but the state government and the Commonwealth and the local government will all work on addressing the strategic directions and priorities for communities, and the national voice will look at Commonwealth legislation that applies to everybody across all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across the nation. Because what happens that often we don't recognise is that only 20% of the funding effort in Indigenous affairs comes from the Commonwealth. The other 80% comes from the states and territories. And when we talk $32 billion and whatever, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are the only population group in Australia where the governments actually itemise any funding that they believe is getting presented to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. No other group is classified this way. So it includes things like basic citizenship rights, the social security rights that all Australians are entitled to, but they package that together for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. They say we're 3% of the population, so all the major departments all have to declare how much they spend. So generally that's around about 3% of their budgets. That all gets pooled together. Over the years, things like purchases for the National Gallery on Aboriginal art has been Aboriginal expenditure. If a government department goes out and builds an office in a state or territory, and that's high cost, then that's all classed as Aboriginal expenditure. But when we go down and we drill down on it, the actual money that goes to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander programs is minuscule, really. And so there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation out there that we have to address. But that said, by having a voice, what it allows is when these programs get developed, that we'll be able to have a say. And there's plenty of evidence across programs, historically and even contemporary programs, that have benefited when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have had a say in the way that they're not only designed but implemented as well. And that's the bit that's lacking at the moment, that opportunity to present, except in a few cases around the nation.
And it's interesting, as someone in Parliament, I think, what I think the value for me as someone who is part of the lawmakers of the country is to actually have that impartial voice that's not political, it's not aligned to one party or the other, it's actually just talking about what is the difference, what is the perspective of the Aboriginal community on a really important issue that is going to affect them. Like, I think for me that will be of huge value. And similarly, other, I've talked to a number of Aboriginal communities who tell me about the sort of fly in, fly out bureaucrats who come in and, well-meaning, trying to make a difference, but because there's not that actual tangible and long-term engagement, that's where they're sort of missing the opportunity to actually solve the problems as people see them on the ground. So that's some of the feedback I've got.
And it is only providing advice. It's not. It doesn't have any veto rights. It can't direct the Parliament. Can't determine whether legislation goes through or not. And then there's the other consideration or concern that some people have expressed. Well, if they don't listen to the voice, if the government of the day doesn't listen to the voice, then they'll take it to the High Court. Furphy. Because what we also argue is that it's the responsibility of the Parliament, not the government of the day, but the Parliament. And so, we rely on the Allegras and others in there to be able to take it up if they see merit in the advice that is being presented by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Then it's up to them to run as a Parliament and take these issues forward. What we don't realise is that already there are many bodies who are already providing advice to the Parliament. Things like the Australian National Audit Office, the Australian Human Rights Commission, the Auditor General, the Australian Law Reform Commission. They all provide advice to the government or to the Parliament, and sometimes the Parliament will pick up on them, other times they just get shelved. So, advice is advice, it's not direction.
Thank you, Tom, for that. Look, I've got a follow-up question, which is a question a lot of people have is, I've seen polling that says around 80% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people support the voice, but there is around a 20% that don't. So can you give me some sort of insight into why some Indigenous Australians are opposing the voice?
Yeah, well, some you just don't know why, because their arguments aren't sound, but there's not logic in them, and sometimes I don't support it, but if you give me this, then I'll put my support behind it, and you go, well, hang on, that's got nothing to do with the voice and the principle behind providing advice to the Parliament and the executive government. I think like all peoples of Australia, we differ. Our experiences differ, and we'll come and look at issues from different perspectives. And, a couple of the big common ones, we're going to lose our sovereignty if we go and get mentioned in the Constitution. Well, sorry, sovereignty would already rest with the Parliament for the state. And if you look at the international or the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I think it's around about Article 46 or so, just towards the end, it says nothing in that declaration, which is directed towards Indigenous peoples of the world, overrides the sovereignty of the state. So that's internationally recognised. What Aboriginal sovereignty is about is that as Aboriginal people, we have the rights over our own languages, our own cultures. Sometimes it's over land, where we've got access to land, and we've not ceded that. We still have that. We still own that. What we don't own is sovereignty over the nation, and it's not, what Aboriginal people have got to, some of the advocates for sovereignty have got to recognise is that they will never have sovereignty over the nation. It's just not a concept that's internationally recognised, except for their own nation, and so that's a bit of an issue. And the other big one is that we want a treaty first before we want to sign up to a voice. But the two arguments against that is, one is that, the voice will be the opportunity to be able to facilitate a treaty if and when it ever happens. But a treaty is something that, a national treaty, we heard before, 250 different tribal groups, it's still around about that people have to have a relationship with, or the Parliament, which is one sovereign entity, has to have 250 treaties, in fact, not just one treaty for the nation. And that's why the states and territories are well advanced on the Commonwealth in developing treaty bodies, so they're starting to have negotiations with their own people to develop treaties, and that will happen long before the national treaty will take place.
Thank you. This question's for you, Shireen. I think, the question some people ask is it giving us Indigenous Australians special privileges that other people don't get? So I think also, Ruby, you might have some perspectives on this.
Well, I think it's important to realise that Indigenous peoples in Australia do occupy a distinct legal, political and historical position. So as I mentioned, they were the only group specifically excluded through race-based provisions in the Constitution of 1901. So they were singled out. And of course, they were the only group who were in Australia when the British arrived. So they were the only group dispossessed in this continent. When the 1967 referendum removed those explicit exclusions of Indigenous people from the Constitution and gave Parliament a power, the race power, broadened the race power, as Tom said. After that, Parliament only ever uses that power to make special laws and policies in relation to Indigenous people. So before 1967, the race power was never used. After 1967, that special power has only been used to make special laws and policies for Indigenous people to address that history of dispossession. So, for example, the Native Title Act, right? Closing the gap policies, etc. Heritage protection policies. And it doesn't only use that power, it also uses its plethora of other constitutional powers as well. So, Indigenous Australians do occupy this distinct constitutional position. It's just the reality. Parliament and government do make laws and policies specifically relating to Indigenous people. All the Uluru Statement is asking for is the ability for Indigenous communities around the country to be able to give Parliament and government advice on those laws and policies, hopefully to prevent a repeat of some of the injustice and unfair and discriminatory policies that have been made about them in the past, and also hopefully to improve those policies. I mean, that's really what is important to understand about what the Uluru Statement is asking for. They're asking to partner with government and Parliament to create better policies to improve practical outcomes in Indigenous affairs. Because, as we all know, Australia is fundamentally failing to close the gap, right? Despite a lot of goodwill in the Australian population and despite many billions of dollars spent every year to try to fix the gap, we are fundamentally failing to improve the position of Indigenous people in this country. And on some indicators, we're going backwards, right? So we are not making progress. And the key thing that the Uluru Statement asks for is to walk together, to partner, to shift from a top-down power relationship to a partnership approach, a constitutional commitment to dialogue and partnership and listening. And that's what this is. So I think if we understand the reality and the history, that is that the Parliament and government make laws and policies trying to improve the position of Indigenous communities. This is saying Indigenous communities want to be an active part of that. They want to partner and have a say in those decisions.
Ruby, did you want to add anything to that?
Absolutely not.
Okay,
That's amazing.
She did a great job. Look, a question sometimes people ask, and I think I'm trying to ask all the tricky questions because, you know, the tricky questions are the questions that have been more sort of controversial. One question is, well, why aren't Indigenous MPs and a Minister for Indigenous Affairs enough representation? That is a question that is that I'm asked. So, Tom, Ruby, could you, who's willing to start on that one?
Let me go. Yeah. Well, the first thing, with the exception of independents, the Allegras and her colleagues, most other politicians are bound by their parties. They're elected by their constituents, and so they have to represent their constituents. A few of the Indigenous parliamentarians do have very high Indigenous constituencies. By and large, the rest don't. Some can speak with some authority, some of those 11 elected members, but they can't speak across the board, and they're often directed by the party. And we see that already in the party. You know, one party will say, we're not going to support it. Another one says, well, you know, I want all of my cabinet ministers to be bound, or my shadow cabinet ministers, to be bound by the party which is a no, but the rest can have a free vote. And you know, the backbenchers and so forth. So we've got that sort of predicament in there. And you know, the two things for me is, A, we need party-free politics when it comes to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, so that we're not becoming the political football that we continually have. And the second is that we can't have an expectation that just because you're Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, that you can represent all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And that's why, and whilst we have 11 now, the next election I can bet we won't have 11 because there's a couple there that won't get up again.
Yeah, and I would just add, just like sort of flipping the perspective of that question around is, just because a Member of Parliament happens to have Indigenous descent doesn't mean that they want that to be part of their policy decisions. I think part of equality is that we can all participate equally in the democracy regardless of our identity. And so, you know, why should they represent all Indigenous people? They are there to represent their electorate who elected them and their political party.
Thanks, Thanks, Ruby. Just another question which I don't think we've put on the list, but is certainly one that some people have been focused on, which is, what detail do we have about how the voice will operate, and do we have enough detail on that? Maybe I'll start with you, Shireen, on that question.
So there's been a lot of work done, and Tom, you've overseen a lot of that work under the past government. Tom and Marcia Langton, Ruby's mum, oversaw a very thorough co-design process, which put forward options for what the legislative design of the voice could look like. But it's really important to understand that what you'll be voting for in the referendum is not the detail, because the Constitution is not the place where you set out legislative details. That's not what it does. As I said before, the Constitution requires Parliament to set up institutions. That's the primary role of the Constitution, right? So it makes sense that the Constitution should also require Parliament to set up this institution, and then it leaves Parliament to determine the details through legislation. And that's really important because those details will need to be able to evolve over time, because no institution's going to be perfect, right? So future parliaments will need to evolve and improve the institution. But what you'll be voting for in the referendum is the principle. Should we have an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, right? That's the principle. Should Indigenous people be finally recognised in the Constitution through having an advisory voice in their affairs? That's the principle, and it's for Parliament to evolve and improve the detail over time.
Tom, did you want to add anything, given you how much work you have? You know something about this.
Yeah, just that first slide you had actually wasn't the question that was going to the referendum. The question is much briefer than that. That's the 129 is the section that's going to be inserted in the Constitution after a successful vote. So it'll be a very, very basic question, whether you want Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to have a voice and to be recognised as the first Australians, and yes or no. It's as simple as that. And then if it's a yes vote, then they'll insert that section 129 into the Constitution, and that gives the direction for what the legislative or the bill will be post the successful referendum. One of the things, and why it's got to be so simple, is that when it becomes complicated, that's when it becomes very ambiguous in what's in the Constitution, potentially, and that's what happened with the 1999 referendum when it came to the discussion about whether we'd become a republic or not. There was too much in the question that left it open for interpretation, and those who wanted to oppose it could easily pull holes in it. And the other big one that we refer to was in the referendum of September 1977, where detail went into the referendum question, and that was about the retirement age of judges. And it's very specific. Judges should retire at 70 in the High Court. A lot of people rue that statement because, in 1977, 70 was old. 2017 or 2023, it's not so old. You're still very productive. Hitting 70 this year, so I want to feel that I'm still going to be productive. But that's what happens, when too much detail goes in the Constitution. There's no way around it unless there's another referendum, which is to change it. And there was the argument that maybe they should have just said that the Parliament would determine the age of retirement for federal court judges and High Court judges, etc. And that's why the move is to have a very basic question, basic but a little bit with all that background information to it to make that decision.
Thank you. Look, I've now moved to questions that have been submitted to us via Google Forms before tonight from members of our community. Thank you everyone who has submitted questions. We won't get a chance to go through all the questions, but I think there are there are a bunch of them hopefully we've already covered. The first was from Ron in Malabar, which was a question of how much will the voice cost on an annual basis? Ruby.
Yeah, so I really wanted to answer this question because it's such a funny question to me. But yeah, so as has been explained, I actually learnt so much from what you said earlier about the way that the spending on Indigenous communities is calculated. I didn't know that. That's wild. We know, evidence shows that the policies, the top-down policies that impact Aboriginal communities directly are not working. The Closing the Gap statistics are getting worse and worse by the year. But on the other hand, where policies are made in conjunction with Aboriginal communities, with direct and ongoing consultation with experts and leaders in those communities, the policies work and are extremely effective in their outcomes, and also they're a lot more cost effective because they're not failing over and over again. So yeah, that's the simple answer to that. No one knows how much it will cost on an annual basis as an exact number because it depends on how you calculate it, and
it hasn't been created yet. We don't know what it's going to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
What we do know. Oh, sorry.
Oh. Yeah, so I'd add to that, Ruby, you're right. It depends how it's going to be designed. Depends on the details. But I was really struck by what the former Liberal former president of the Federal Liberal Party, her name's Karina Ocketel. She's used to be Melbourne-based, I think. And she wrote to her Liberal colleagues trying to persuade them to support this proposal. And one of the points she made that really struck me was the voice will help cut waste. Because right now, government makes top-down policies, spends billions of dollars on things that don't work, solutions that don't work. And she said, if governments have to partner with Indigenous communities and listen to Indigenous communities, then Indigenous communities will be able to tell them, well, this program's not working, get rid of that one. Or this program's duplicated, get rid of that one. Or this is a waste of money, get rid of that one. So she said this will actually save money, and I thought that was a very persuasive point from her.
And what most of us don't get to know unless you work in the space, but successively over the years there have been Australian National Audit Office reports or Department of Finance reports. There was a big evaluation of the Indigenous advancement strategy, which was scathing. All of them, their own internal reports are scathing with the way that governments are administering. And it's not just any one party. This is successive. One of the ironies that's frustrating is that if you remember back to 2008 when Kevin Rudd made the national apology, and in there he talked about a new way about going about business, and really engaging, hearing, involving Aboriginal trusted honour people. Jenny Macklin then said that, and before you knew it, they were out of government, and we had a new government in, and therefore, it changed again, and that's what you opened with, the whim of governments that have been one of the major problems with Indigenous affairs here. And it's not only the government, but it's the change of ministers. Since the Close the Gap campaign started, that reported it in 2006, we've seen 10 prime ministers come through. Instability plus, but that's at the political level, not at the community level. And you look at the number of ministers for Indigenous affairs, you look at the number of bureaucrats that change through the system. And as they change, everybody wants to put their own fingerprints on a new program. So there's such churn that the recipients of the service who are not having a say are the ones that are most affected. And it's because of bureaucracy and parliamentary changes. But the government has put aside money for both the regional, the local and regional administrative structures, because once they're established, they will have a small secretariat to be able to assist them to develop up the local strategies and identify the priorities, which they'll then negotiate with the three tiers of government. Because when we did our consultations and visited communities, it was ridiculous. On on Thursday Island in the Torres Straits, population of about 2,000 people on there, they had 37 different agencies, both Commonwealth and Queensland and NGOs, coming into that community, most of them asking them similar questions. Boggabilla here, in New South Wales, and another project I worked on, had something like 90 different agencies working in that community. Of 300 people, you've got your own personal advisor, but they're still one of the most impoverished communities. It's just ridiculous. And what we're hoping is that our inputs will help save money and make things much more efficient. Because the close the gap is important, because there have been progression in there. When it comes to life expectancy, though, the gap's not closing because the non-Indigenous life expectancy is also improving, and so we're running parallel. It's not closing, and you need a lot more investment in a whole range of areas that are more directed if we are going to make a difference. And that's what I try to say to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. If you're happy with the status quo, vote no. If you want to see a change, vote yes.
We've got a next question from Raphael in Dover Heights. And the question is about, would the Voice be able to launch a legal challenge to the High Court if its position is rejected by Parliament? If so, how would this work? And could it clog up the court? So this really comes to is the Voice going to be, is it going to be challengeable and challenge things in the High Court? Shireen, perhaps you could answer that.
So it's very important to understand that the Voice the idea of a constitutionally guaranteed Indigenous advisory body was developed in 2014 with constitutional conservatives precisely to avoid this, right? So it is actually the most constitutionally conservative proposal that has ever been on the table. When you think about what the previous options were, in the past they talked about a new preamble to the Constitution. Now that would enable the High Court to potentially reinterpret the entire Constitution, and conservative constitutional experts who don't want to see High Court uncertainty oppose a preamble for that reason. Another proposal that used to be on the table was the idea of a racial non-discrimination guarantee in the Constitution. Now that was opposed by constitutional conservatives as well, because it would enable a lot of litigation. That's an example of a change to the Constitution that works through litigation, right? The idea of a constitutionally guaranteed Indigenous advisory body was intended to work through the political process rather than through the courts. That was the entire way it was conceived, was to address concerns about litigation, about the High Court being able to strike down Parliament's laws and policies, and to come up with something that upholds the Constitution and respects parliamentary supremacy. And when I say that it was developed with people, who were very passionate about protecting the Constitution and keeping the High Court out of law and policy making, it was people like Julian Leeser, who's now a member of the Liberal Party, but back then he was the convener of the hardcore Samuel Griffiths Society, very dedicated to protecting the Constitution. This concept was developed with people like him. So that's very important to understand. This is just advisory. So there's no veto, as Tom said. So if, let's say, the body gives advice to Parliament or government, and Parliament and government doesn't listen to the advice, doesn't implement it, so what happens? Well, nothing, because it's just advisory. This is a proposal that works through political influence, right? Through political persuasiveness and political influence. The vast weight of constitutional legal opinion has confirmed that there is no huge risk of, getting clogged up in the courts and things like that. There's been a lot of noise lately in the last few months about the Voice's ability to give advice to the executive government as well as Parliament. Have some of you heard some of those concerns? The Voice's ability to give advice to the executive as well as Parliament was there from the start. Since 2014, it was put in there by those constitutional conservatives who are so passionate about protecting the Constitution and respecting parliamentary supremacy. In fact, it was Julian Leeser, a member of the Liberal Party, who said to us, it's very important that the Voice is able to provide advice to Parliament and government. He said, because by the time policies reach Parliament, policy positions are already very locked in. He said, if you want this advisory body to have a real impact, make a real difference, it's got to be able to give advice on policy in development, right? So that has been there from the start. I don't think there's any risk of a constitutional implication of a duty to, consult the Voice or to consider the advice or things that people have been fear-mongering about. That is not in the words of the amendment, and the vast majority of legal opinion have said that that can't even really be implied, right, from the words of the constitutional amendment. So this is a very modest constitutional amendment, very conservative, and what I think is remarkable is that the Uluru Statement adopted such a pragmatic proposal that respects the Constitution. Last thing I'll say about the modesty of it, think about what the Constitution is. The Constitution gives the former colonies, now the states, an equal voice in the system. Think about it. Why does Tasmania have small state like Tasmania has an equal number of senators as New South Wales and Victoria?
I do wonder that some days.
Yeah. If you have a look at the Constitutional Convention debates, it's because they believed that the historic political communities should be heard, even the very small ones. And there's more Indigenous people than Tasmanians, actually. So this is a conservative proposal that fits with the founding philosophy of the Constitution and gives the most ancient political community, the First Nations, a voice in their affairs.
And I think the understanding that not just anybody can go and get an audience with the High Court. They've got to go through a number of other processes beforehand, and those processes, if they see merit, it might get up, but they'll knock it off. And part of what the 129 section in the amendment to the Constitution is about, the reference point for any litigation to be assessed against. And that then talks about, creating the voice and the opportunity. The other really important one that a lot of people don't understand also is that in the Parliament, for a piece of legislation that comes through, there's two standing committees, a Bill Scrutiny Committee that looks at the bill that comes in that's being proposed, and that identifies whether it conflicts with or duplicates, etc., any other existing legislation. And then there's a Human Rights Committee, standing committee, which looks to see whether that proposed piece of legislation, the bill, actually conforms to our human rights obligations. And a third one that doesn't get a lot of reference is a standing committee looking at delegated responsibilities. And why the executive government is in there as well is that there's about 1,500 pieces of delegated responsibilities that the secretaries of departments and entities all control, that don't go through Parliament. They can manage that themselves. And that's why it's important to be able to have that direct relationship. And that's also been encouraged by secretaries who of departments who think that there's a need for it.
And I just being in Parliament, I wholeheartedly agree with that, because when you look at the legislation, there's so much that goes on that's not legislation, that's actually policy. And so if it's only to Parliament, it's only to the legislation, as opposed to all those other actually activities of government and programs of government, which where so much of that difference really is made. Then we'll move to the next question, which is from Rosalind in Paddington. Is there a reason why the Voice could not be set up and operational before we're asked to vote on an alteration to the Constitution? Do you want to have a go of that one, or Shireen, which one?
Well, it could, but that's not what we want, because it will be set up by legislation post a referendum. One of the key things about having it in the Constitution is that it gives some certainty that a Parliament of the day, or a government, if they control both houses of Parliament, can't cease the operations of that entity. If it's in the constitution, then only the people through another referendum can actually change it. What can happen though is that, and we've seen this existing in the past, is that if the Parliament chooses to, or the government of the day chooses to, they can either restrict funding or put controls over entities established by legislation. They can't close it down, but the government of the day determines the funding of those entities. And you know, the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples, which wasn't developed by legislation, it was actually established as a company limited by guarantee. One government supported it, got it all going, changed the government, the next one said we're not going to fund it, and after 10 years they run out of money. And you know, so that was the most recent time that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were able to exert some influence over policy, and that again, that influence was just through a voice and having discussions and negotiations with government departments.
Then the next question was from Josephine in Rose Bay, and the question was, why was there no treaty if there were Aboriginal owners? Who would like to take a go at that one?
Go on, Ruby.
Go on, Ruby.
So this is a fundamental misunderstanding of Australian history, which is why for me, having a referendum this year where all Australians vote on the principle of having an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament in our highest legal document is so important, not just for all of these policy and legal reasons, but for what we can become as a nation. You know, it's a really inspiring opportunity and a rare opportunity that I feel if we can grasp it, it will mean that our national identity will fundamentally change for the better, because it will mean that we can start to have a more honest relationship and truthful relationship with our history. Tom has already talked about the doctrine of terra nullius, which was the basis of the British colonisation of this country. And that means empty land, land of no people. So we literally we didn't exist at the beginning of colonisation. So they didn't see them as the original owners. And why didn't they form a treaty? Well, because they didn't comply with their own instructions from the king, which instructed them to form peaceful relations with the natives. Instead of doing that, they decided that we were not human. Yeah.
The land of no peoples, which meant that they weren't obliged to strike a treaty as they had to in other colonised nations where people existed there. And you know, if you look at it, there's a whole range of arguments about there was no housing structure, no infrastructure that indicated people actually lived here, and that's in part because of the nomadic lifestyle and that people practiced in those days a lot more effectively. But that doctrine, which enabled the colonisation and enabled the government, when first established, to be able to give out land grants to all the settlers and so forth, which then, you know, didn't recognise us, was overturned in 1992 with the High Court decision, known as the Mabo decision, which was able to be argued that people did exist, and they looked at the structures up on the island of Muir in the Torres Straits, and to see that there were fish traps that date back pre-colonisation. And then as they further explored it, they've found a lot more evidence. Brewarren are the fish traps down there, the eagle traps in Victoria and so forth. But it didn't fit within the concepts of the time of the British, of what they considered to be a peoples here first. So they didn't have to negotiate a treaty, and that's where it all started, and why we didn't. But in 1840, in New Zealand, which came after us, they struck the Treaty of Waitangi with all the Maori groups. But there was only one group, one language group, Maori, a number of different dialects, but they were all able to get together, and they had to strike a treaty with them. And so that's prevailed since then, and as part of that treaty it recognised that New Zealand Maori people were citizens of New Zealand. So they've had that right. Ours, effectively, we were recognised as citizens, but we weren't counted in the census until the 67 referendum. And so, you know, our start, and, you know, a lot of people have mentioned, my father mentioned it as well, that that was the time that we got opportunities to be able to be treated a lot more equally in relation to employment, and it just coincided with the Waddy Creek walk-off the year before, 1966, and the fight for equal wages. So all these things are very contemporary in real terms. And, you know, we looked at, because of the treaties in New Zealand, or the treaty in New Zealand, the treaty in other colonised countries in America and US, their first Indigenous medical doctors were graduating in the 1890s. Our first Indigenous medical doctor was 1983 in Helen Milroy. So we're, you know, decades and decades, almost a century behind other countries, because we weren't recognised until 67 when we were counted, and as the Uluru Statement said, and then in 92 when we were recognised as being here as the first peoples.
I think we've covered the next question then, which was about New Zealand, but maybe I'll go to I think a really important question, which is, what is the responsibility of allies in the lead up to this campaign, and how do we hold our politicians accountable to promote mature and respectful conversation and debate on both sides of this referendum regarding the voice? So I'm the last person who should ask this question, so someone else, go for it.
Well, yeah, so I've just been volunteering on lots of different things. You know, I'm not, yeah, so I found that a really interesting process of, like, just basically using my own personal sphere of influence to start conversations, you know, within the schools that I'm connected through family, and within my workplace. And the thing that I found is there's a hunger for knowledge on this topic, and so you've all come here tonight. Hopefully you're a lot more informed. I'd highly recommend you buy a copy of this book by Thomas Mayo and Kerry O'Brien, because it's really good and really simple. And you know, you're empowered to go and take this out to your communities. Even one conversation can make a difference. And the other thing is, just listen to people. It's really important to understand that everyone's going to have a difference of opinion, and that's okay. It's okay to disagree.
Yeah, I think that's right, and that's one publication. The voice.gov.au is a website that the government's established, which has got a whole lot of impartial information out there that helps to explore it. Quite a number of other publications are out there now. But to become informed, I think it's fantastic that you're here tonight, but this should be seen as a beginning. You know, it's really taken those conversations to the family, to the workplace, particularly if you've got family living in regional and remote areas. Help to inform them, because what we're seeing through the polling is that it's the older generation, some of you might fit in that category, that are either teetering about yes or no, or they're in the no camp. And I think in part is because not having the knowledge. And one of the big groups is men over 50. You know, that's me and a couple of you guys. But fortunately, youth and women are right there, and the urban vote is very positive. So conversations, being informed and having an informed conversation. I personally would like to see a lot more people writing into some of the conservative newspapers with comments to address some of the misinformation that's out there, and and everybody gets their 2 minutes of fame by writing a couple of paragraphs, and it gets published. But there needs to be more people who are able to challenge these and address many of the questions that we had tonight, which are really good questions.
We're going to have, I think, time for just one question from the floor, and this one we've sort of touched on a bit, but you hear from the opposition that they're saying regional voices are better than a Canberra voice. So how would you address that? Because it is one of the talking points that people have. Tom, maybe to you?
Okay. Well, there's a Canberra voice and a Canberra voice. The voice that's going to be the national voice, which is going to be operating out of Canberra, because that's where the most effect's going to be with the Australian Parliament. That's going to comprise of people that have been nominated from the states. And so it's not the Canberra elite, not that I've got anything against the Canberra elite, good guys, some of us. No, but what's important is that we need all those voices. We need to have people strong who are able to talk to the politicians. We need to have these people who are going to represent or be nominated from each of the jurisdictions. And under the provisions that we've proposed is not only do each state and territory offer up 2 people, and we've been very clear that it should be 1 male and 1 female, and that the whole gender equality needs to prevail all of the voice at all levels. That there's also provision to have 5 people that can be nominated to fill any of the gaps, and those sort of gaps are if from the state and territory nominated people, we don't have somebody who's maybe a law person from a remote community, then they can be sought out and appointed to the body. So there's those 5 opportunities, and there's 2 standing committees, one on youth and the other with people with disabilities, who will be established to work with the national voice. So even though it's going to be Canberra-based, it is comprised from people out in the regions. Thank
you. Look, I wanted to finish off with just actually a question to each of you, and which is, we've talked a lot about the technicalities and some of addressing some of the challenges to the voice, but I guess you're all passionately supportive of the voice, and so, I'd love just that sort of final point is of, why are you dedicating so much of your time and effort and passion and courage to this question? Why is it so important to you?
I guess I'm just blown away by the generosity of what Indigenous people have come to us and offered. Because think about it, that history I talked about, that being excluded, being treated like they didn't exist under the doctrine of terra nullius, being excluded from the Constitution, laws and policies treating them very badly. Yet after all that, and by the way, a history of violence as well, which we all know happened, and after all of that exclusion and mistreatment, they're coming to us and saying, we want in. We want into the Australian Constitution that didn't want us, and we want to be part of Australia. Like, we don't want separatism, they're asking for inclusion, partnership, dialogue. And I just think how incredible that after that history, all they're asking of us is an advisory voice in laws and policies made about them, not a veto, just an advisory voice. So the pragmatic modesty of that proposal, I think, is extraordinary. And, I'm the daughter of Indian and Fijian migrants to this country. And I was reminded growing up, like, my parents came from poor backgrounds, worked hard here, had access to opportunities. And yes, we had some discrimination as well. But by and large, me and my people here in this country have prospered. We've had access to good opportunities. And that simply has not been the case. We've had access to better opportunities than Indigenous Australians. And this might be the only chance that migrants and descendants of migrants have to truly give back to Indigenous people who've lost so much. I'll just add, please don't be passive bystanders in this, you know. We should be optimistic, but we cannot afford to be complacent. And this will only get over the line if every single person in this room who has goodwill, who thinks this is a fair and modest request, it will only get over the line if every single one of us goes out and persuades as many people as humanly possible. Then this might succeed.
Ruby, to you, why are you giving your passion and your time to this?
You're a hard act to follow, Shireen. Well, I just think about the day after the referendum and how I would feel if we lose and how I would feel if we win. And if we lose, I would be devastated personally, obviously, but for our country and for our nation, that we couldn't accept the people who've been here for 60,000 years into our highest legal document. I think Australians are better than that. And I think if we win, it will be incredible. It would be absolutely amazing. And I have a plan. After the referendum happens, I really want to go back to country, which I haven't done in a really long time. And it's a mission to get there, 2 days of complicated travel. This year, because I have a lot of cousins whose parents were part of the stolen generation or who were removed because of various different policies from country. I've had the opportunity in the last few years to reconnect with a lot of them, and so we all of us want to together as cousins to go back to country after the referendum. And I think either way it will be, if we win, it'll be a huge celebration, and if we lose, it'll be coming together and holding each other.
Yeah, look, this is part of a journey for me. It's something that I've been exposed to for most of my life in trying to search for a better position for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, and in those roles, being a long-term public servant, being frustrated that with such a churn in both the political sphere and the bureaucratic sphere, that we haven't seen the level of changes that we need to see. This is a great opportunity, I think, to be able to do that, because the evidence globally shows that when people are involved in programs, that they're more likely to succeed. And from a human rights terms, that what we say there is that people who are the recipients of any government legislation or programs need to be, the most affected people need to be involved in the process. So we've got all of those sort of tensions there that are good tensions that can see change. I'm also co-chair, mentioned earlier, of Reconciliation Australia, and over the last decade we've just seen how Australians are really coming together in the spirit of reconciliation, and there are so many good people out there that want to see change, and so this is an opportunity to be able to help progress that. We know that through programs like the Narragansett program, where there's over or close to 10,000 schools and early childhood centres that are now looking at an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander curriculum, that our future is going to be better with our kids who are coming through this system, because they're getting an appreciation of a real history of Australia that many of us were denied in our going through, and we're just learning about now. So, but we can't wait for them and a referendum in another 10 years when they're old enough to vote. We need to be able to do it now, while there's people here who have got the capacity to understand the plight. And you look at one of the great things that's here is, well, it's not so great, but Newcastle University's now mapped out many of the massacre sites around Australia, so that's a bit of the truth-telling that's happening. But the Myall Creek massacre site, where we've seen both the Indigenous people who were the massacred and the descendants of those who were perpetrating the massacres coming together, working together in the spirit of reconciliation to help educate, inform and to empower people to have a better future. And that's what it's about. It's about hope and a better future.
Thank you so much. It is absolutely about hope and about a better future for the whole of this country. I'd like to thank you all so much as panellists this evening for coming and sharing, your perspectives and your deep knowledge of the questions we've asked. And I think also, I want to also thank Jean for your warm introduction, which was a very beautiful introduction. And also to Gertrude and Alice, who are selling, at the entrance, selling the Thomas Mayo and Kerry O'Brien's Voice Handbook. It's an excellent book and I highly recommend it if you're interested. In Shireen's words, I think, if you support this, you can't be a bystander because everybody needs to get involved. I often say that it's quite intimidating as a non-Indigenous person, being someone who's really standing out and leading on this. And the reason why I'm doing this is because many Indigenous people have said to me, look, Allegra, we're 3%, you're 97%. We cannot carry the country alone. You and the non-Indigenous parts of this country, you need to stand up, you need to be allies, you need to be advocates for this. And that is absolutely 100% true for this evening. So thank you everyone for coming, because you've taken the first step, which is you've got informed, and that has got to be the first start of this, and in a respectful, and I think it's been a very, very respectful conversation. Now, if you are supporting yes, then get out there and tell people about it. If you want to get really actively involved, you can get involved with Wentworth The Voice. We're setting up a group of volunteers around this community who are going to be actively campaigning for The Voice. We're also, but you can also just buy a t-shirt if that's your version of campaigning. We're selling them out the front. But please, this is your time to make a change and make a change to our country. And I just to finish, I have to say I still think the best encapsulation I think of Australia and our identity, I think, is in the words of Noel Pearson when he said we are three things in this country. He said, we are the gift of 65,000 years of continuous civilization, the longest continuous civilization of any place in the world. We are the gift of the British institutions and democracy, of your forebears who gave us, I think, a vibrant and strong democracy that is so important to our country. And we are a gift of the most successful multicultural country in the world. We have failures and shortcomings, but we still are people who can come together like no other people, I think, around the world. These are the parts of our story. These are the weaving together of the Australian story. And I think for me, this is the opportunity with The Voice to open a new chapter on our story and for all of us to write on that page about our future history. So thank you everyone for coming here tonight.